Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video for the 5-year anniversary of one of my personal favorite games in the Final Fantasy series, I will be talking about Final Fantasy 15, which I do find to be a hard game to really assess. It's a game that I loved the first time I played it, and because I do feel very attached to this game. But over the course of my most recent replay, I do feel like my opinion on this game has, as a whole, dropped. Not significantly to where I dislike the game now or anything like that, but I do think replaying the game now, I do recognize many of this game's flaws, particularly from a narrative perspective. But again, I do still love the game. I still love this game's world. I love the game's characters. I love the game's grand scale. But I would be lying if I didn't say I came out of this playthrough with way more flaws than I thought I had coming into it. But let's start getting more in detail here, starting with the gameplay related aspects of the game. So let's start talking about the open world. Now, most of the game does take place in the kingdom of Lucius, and you spend most of the game traveling further and further away from the kingdom's capital, Insomnia, with more sections getting unlocked chapter after chapter. Now, the main way you navigate around the open world is through your party's car, the Regalia, which I really loved as a system within this game, where you can either choose to drive yourself or get Ignis to drive for you, which can lead to a lot of downtime when traveling between locations. But I do also like how the game handles this downtime, where the characters can randomly start conversations and bring up potential short quests for you to do. You can also use this time to really take in this open world, which obviously does have some pretty nice sceneries throughout. Though in comparison to the many other open world games from the 8th generation like The Witcher 3, Horizon Zero Dawn, Red Dead 2, this game's world does obviously pale in comparison to those. Now, outside of the Regalia, you can also rent chocobos, which I did find to be really fun to ride around in the open world. I did really like how they gained experience over time and gained new abilities to boon your experience navigating around the world. This game does also allow you to fast travel to locations you've already been through the Regalia, which really does help out when trying to complete a lot of the side quests in the game, which do make you go back and forth between pretty disparate areas. Now we can talk about the side quests, which for the most part you get from the same few characters one after another, with a lot of them being pretty similar, really just changing up the locations that you end up going to. There are a set of quests where you have to catch a particular fish, one where you have to take photos at certain locations, ones where you have to retrieve dog tags from dead soldiers, ones where you have to retrieve items for vendors. I mean, these missions don't really vary too much from what you would expect from your typical RPG. Again, a lot of just fetch quests or clearing out a group of enemies, which at first I didn't mind this repetitive gameplay loop, but the loop does go on and on and on, in which it really feels like a never-ending cycle of quests that really did start to bore me after a while. And in general, I will say that most of the side content in this game does feel pretty tacked on and just feels like something that is there to prolong the game over actually enhancing the experience as a whole. Now, like most RPGs, there are dungeons in the game, and some of them are included in the main story, though a good chunk of them are purely optional. Now, for the most part, they are relatively simple, though some of the higher level dungeons did really annoy me, and I didn't end up finishing all of them on my replay. Though through these, you do get some of the better royal arms in the game, these special weapons that end up being the best weapons to use within the game. Now let's talk about the combat system, which I remembered loving when I originally played it, but again, on the replay, I do look at it as an inferior version of Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat, which improves upon a lot of what this combat system does. I mean, this game is an action RPG, so the combat is in real time, but you have the ability to freeze time in order to more methodically choose your attacks, just like Final Fantasy VII Remake. While there is a wide range of weapons you can use, I typically did focus around using the royal arms. Again, they are typically the strongest weapons in the game, though even within just those, the weapons do vary quite a bit, so I never really felt the need to go beyond the royal arms that I had. Now, something I do have a bit of an issue with here is I never liked the controls of the game's combat system, and the game does have other layouts for you to use, but none of them were my ideal. You obviously have your typical melee attacks, but Noctis can also warp between locations that can add a quicker pace to the combat system, while also just allowing for quicker navigation at points. Noctis can also air step, which can lead to some aerial combat as well, In combat, you can also use firearms, though to be honest, I never really dabbled too much with it. You can also use magic, which is treated a bit differently here than it is in other Final Fantasy games, where in the world you can absorb these elemental magics like fire, ice, and electricity, and then using those magics, you can craft magic attacks that you end up equipping and using as weapons, which I think is an interesting way to approach magic in this game, though I do still prefer the older school format that, again, we see used in a very similar combat system in FF7 Remake, which I do think just works better in that game. Again, another strange thing about this game's combat is how the HP system is handled, where in most games you lose your health, it's game over, right? But here, when you lose your HP, instead of dying, you're put into a danger mode where you can't attack or use abilities until your health has been restored, which is easy to do by just using a potion. But while in this mode, your max HP does start to decrease, and if that reaches 0, you will get knocked out to where you can only be revived by revival items. Now, if you're knocked out for too long, you do eventually die, but that's a lot of safety nets given to the player, to where the only time I've ever died while playing this game has been when I did so on purpose just to figure out how the system works. So while you might get into encounters that would require you to use a number of recovery items, it would take a lot for you to actually die during the actual combat section, which I don't personally mind, but it does kind of take away from the challenge of the game, especially because even if you don't have the items that you need, your party members can also rescue you at points. So again, I just feel like in general, the combat system in this game is pretty easy, to which, depending on the type of person that you are, I can definitely see that being a massive complaint with this game's gameplay. Now, speaking of your party members, they do also play a major role in the combat system, obviously assisting you when you're in danger. You can also command them to do special attacks that you can later follow up on by finishing QuickTime events, which are beneficial especially against stronger enemies within the game. And overall, the use of your party members in the combat system really does go along with the themes of friendship and brotherhood that this game's story revolves around. Though I will say that I was disappointed that you don't actually ever get to play as your party members. Unlike FF7 Remake, where in that game, when you switch between characters, you actually play as those characters. Here, you can only actually ever play as Noctis, again, only going to these other characters for special attacks, to where you just see them play out their animations instead of actually getting to play as them. Summons do return for this game as well, though, to be honest, I don't really remember many times outside of the main story where I would have the opportunity to actually use them. Now again, this is an RPG, so there is a leveling system in this game, and through that you do get ability points that you use in the Ascension grid, which I never particularly liked this system. To me, it just felt overly complicated with there being 9 different skill trees, and the amount of points needed to upgrade things varied greatly to where, to be honest, again, I just didn't focus on it too much on my replay. And to be fair, a lot of that came from the luxury of me playing my latest playthrough on New Game Plus, which functions how I typically would want a New Game Plus to function. I never liked forced level scaling in New Game Pluses, which I know many other games do. For me, the fun of New Game Plus is being able to slaughter your way through enemies without any real difficulty, and that was something that I did find fun on the replay of this game. Now, the game does also have a day and night cycle, which is pretty important to the gameplay, as during nights, demons will roam the open world and typically make navigation at night a pain, especially because initially you can't autopilot the Regalia at night. Now, this also affects the fishing system, which I never liked the fishing sections in the game, though it is entirely optional here. But trying to do every side quest in the game does lead to you wasting a lot of time trying to get this fishing spots at the right time so you can find the fish that you need. The day and night cycle also affects how you level up in the game, as whenever you get XP, it accumulates, but it doesn't actually get added to your character right away. Instead, you have to rest at a camp at which you can get XP bonuses before the XP is actually tallied. You can also get other status boosts in the game through eating meals at camps or restaurants, but again, I didn't really focus on that too much in my most recent replay. Though I did like the varying number of options that the game gives you in dealing with these systems within the game. Now, that is most of what I have to say about the gameplay. Now let's talk about the narrative, which again, I stated this earlier, I really love the world building and the lore of this game. I really love learning about the backstories of these major factions in the world and the politics revolving around them. I do love the main group of characters. I mean, Noctis is a character I really loved on my initial playthrough, and I still enjoy his arc here as well, with it really encapsulating the themes of friendship and destiny that really drive this game's story. And through those themes of friendship, Noctis' relationships with Ignis, Gladius, and Prompto really are the make and break for the story for me. I did really like the roles that each of those characters played and how they played off of Noctis' character, though realistically I would have liked it if each of those characters were developed a bit more, which to me comes off as them holding back these characters to have content for the DLCs that revolve around these characters, which I think you can definitely knock them for. But going back to those themes of friendship and destiny, those are themes that are so prominent in a lot of the media I would consume when I was a kid, and I do think that greatly factored into why I adored this game as much as I did on my first time playing it, as it did make me feel really nostalgic for a lot of these shows that I would be obsessed with when I was younger. But with that, I think it's time to run through this story. Right off the bat, we do get a scene from the penultimate fight in the game with Ifrit, which I always found to be a strange way to start here. I mean, I get that they're trying to introduce this theme of friendship and brotherhood right away, but at the end of the day, to me, this felt like a really unmemorable way to start the game here. We then obviously get to Chapter 1, where we catch up with Noctis and his friends as they are beginning their journey to Alticia for Noctis' wedding to Luna Freya, and we do get a great scene pretty early on of the regalia breaking down and the group having to push the car while Stand By Me plays in the background, which the prominence of that song always felt jarring to me, especially coming from a JRPG, though obviously it does fit within the game's themes. Now through this chapter, you obviously get your typical tutorial sections, introduction to some of the side characters like Cindy and Sid, who don't actually end up doing much within the story. I mean, they are notable figures, Cindy in particular, but it's like, at the end of the day, they didn't really need to be there. But the chapter concludes with the news that Niflheim has attacked the city of Insomnia, killing Noctis' father and stealing the crystal that resides within it, really setting up the major conflict within the story. Though I will say that it is really ridiculous how this chapter revolves around finding a way to Alticia, which despite that goal almost being accomplished here within Chapter 1, it does take until Chapter 9 for that goal to actually get accomplished. Chapters 2 and 3 are really where the game opens up, where at this point you do a good bulk of the side content, and the game really encourages that you do some of that through the recommended levels for the main missions. Chapter 2 revolves around meeting up with Kor, who is Noctis' mentor figure, and we do get introduced to the Royal Arms and the dungeons, but we also get tasked with retrieving the Royal Arms, which we do see more of in Chapter 3, which further delays the story's progression, and really that is something I noticed on the replay here, is how slow the game takes the first half of its chapters, really dragging things out unpurposely in my eyes, while the back sections of the game are really rushed narratively. Now, Chapter 3 does introduce us to Lestalem, which is the largest city in the open world, and through this we do get introduced to characters like Talcott and Iris, with Iris being Gladius' sister, and I did find her interactions with Noctis to be really bizarre, considering she's clearly underage. Have them going on a date around the city just felt bizarre. Now, Chapter 4 is a bit more streamlined, with it mostly revolving around our first interaction with Arden, who does end up becoming the game's main antagonist, and is a character I really do love. Again, I love his backstory that obviously doesn't get revealed until later, but him being this long-lost ancestor of Noctis that got betrayed by his brother, and through that has this vendetta against the Callum family. I think that's a really great backstory, and I really love this like playfully menacing vibe that he exudes as well. As for the actual gameplay of Chapter 4, I did find the driving section where you have to follow Arden to be just kind of dumb, but it does lead to the fight against Titan. That is a pretty cool set piece, though it's one that I never liked the actual mechanics of the fight itself, where it's mostly just blocking him whenever he attacks and then bashing on him when he's not. And also from a technical standpoint, There's a lot of like clipping through things through this section that does kind of take you out of it at points. Chapter 5 was one that I completely forgot about, if I'm being honest, but on the replay I found it to just be kind of annoying to play, where the regalia has been taken by the Empire, so you have to spend the entire chapter on foot or on Chocobo, and it's largely just running around the map to touch these rune stones, and all this just felt like filler that technically completes another trial that Noctis needed to complete, but it mostly felt pointless to me. The chapter ends with us infiltrating the stronghold where the regalia is being held, and here we get our first interaction with Ravis, Luna's brother, who was seemingly being set up as this major rival figure within the story, though he doesn't really get much to actually do. But after getting the regalia back, we start chapter 6, which mostly revolves around driving to Cape Kayam, where we plan on setting sail for Alticia finally, and we end up driving there with Iris in our party, and there are opportunities to do side activities along the way. I did like how this chapter gave you the option of whether or not you wanted to do these side quests instead of forcing them on you. Though once you get to the Cape, you would think, oh, we're finally there, we're finally going to Alticia, but then we learn that no, the boat needs to be repaired with mithril ore, and we spend chapter 7 getting it. Again, very clearly just feeling like filler. But also strangely during this chapter, Gladios just leaves our party for like no reason other than to just make a DLC revolving around him. But without Gladios in our party, Aranea ends up joining our party for this one dungeon while we find the ore. And while I found this mission pretty annoying, I do really like Aranea as a character. I just really wish she was utilized more, as after this, she really only has one more minor appearance in the game, and it just feels like a wasted opportunity. And this does lead to chapter 8, where we now need to power the ore, and we go to a power plant in Lestalem, where we work with a mysterious stranger who looks and sounds just like Gladios. And I found this to be really dumb that this is how he's reintroduced in the game, as it isn't given really any context on why he's even there helping out the power plant to begin with, and also like why he even disappeared to begin with. Like, it's all really dumb. But after this, it is time to go to Alticia, so we say goodbye to the people of Lucius, which is the final time we see a lot of these characters in the main story. And this does lead up to chapter 9, where we travel to Alticia, and I do like again how the game gives you the option of either skipping straight to the city, or you can see their entire trip there, which is filled with a lot of dialogue that really just serves as exposition that I really found interesting to listen to, as again it really rounds out the world and the lore of the series. To have that while also seeing the scenery along the way was a really cool moment here, though again one that's entirely skippable. And the city itself is clearly based off of Venice, and again aesthetically it looks really nice, but I've always hated the level design here, where I always found it to be just kind of annoying to navigate through the city. And whenever I play the first mission of this chapter, I do usually get lost on my way to the destination. Though the chapter does end with one of the cooler set pieces in the game, where we have to fight against Leviathan in the middle of the crumbling city. Now, I will say that like the Titan fight, I never loved the actual game mechanics of the fight itself, where there's a lot of warping all across the map and hitting Leviathan as much as you can until the next phase of the fight begins. But this also acts as a massive turning point for the story as well, where in the middle of all this, Arden ends up killing Luna, and she ends up handing Noctis the Ring of the Lucy, which plays a pretty important role later on. But after this, the tone of the game becomes pretty somber, really, for the rest of the game's narrative here, where we find out that Ignis is now blind, and Noctis learns of Luna's death, and they now board the train, heading for the capital of Niflheim in the hopes of getting the crystal back in order to save the world from the Star Scourge, which is now threatening to throw the world into an endless night. And this entire chapter really just shows the group being pretty broken, with Noctis obviously still mourning Luna's death and being really cold to his friends. We do also have a bit of a mini dungeon where we are limited by Ignis coming along, and we have him slowing down the group, obviously due to him being blind. And overall, I did find this section kind of tedious, though narratively it does show the gang trying to work out their issues. Chapter 11 is more of a straight shot, almost entirely being this set piece of fighting against the Empire while warping from ship to ship and moving across the top of a moving train, and all this is really cool. Prompta also gets separated from the group here because, he needed a DLC, but also because Noctis is tricked into pushing him off the train by Arden. overall, this is a pretty short chapter, and to be honest, one that I kind of forgot even happened before my replay. Chapter 12 is another really dark point for the group, now having lost Prompto, and with them now nearing the Niflheim capital, completely undermanned. But to be honest, I found this chapter pretty forgettable outside of Noctis interacting with Shiva, as again, not much of consequence actually happens here, though chapter 13 is where everything goes down, where we start off with a weird driving section to get to the city, but it ends with the Regalia being destroyed, which is a really sad moment, as in many ways the Regalia did feel like the fifth main character of the game. But this is where chapter 13 really picks up narratively, but also goes kind of downhill gameplay-wise, where Noctis gets separated from Gladius and Ignis, and the game gives you the choice over who to follow, which is a fact that I do think is a cool thing that they did. The fact they even bothered to have this option of going for this more narratively important route, but also one that is very annoying gameplay-wise in the Noctis section, or going for Gladius and Ignis, where you do miss out a bit narratively, but you can at least get to the meat and bones a bit quicker. I do like that they did this within the game, though it also makes it clear that even the developers knew that this was just not a fun section of the game. Where if you follow Gladius, you obviously play as him, and this section ends up being pretty short and relatively easy. But 100% for the sake of the narrative, the Noctis path is the better option. The problem is, again, it's a pain to play, where you're playing as Noctis here, being stripped of your normal weapons and only being left with the Ring of the Lucy, which is actually pretty powerful, but it really only drains HP from enemies, and when you're facing off against more than one or two enemies, it can become a bit overwhelming. Also, most of the section does revolve around just walking down narrow corridors all alone while Arden is intimidating you through the intercom. It really makes for a really tedious, hours worth of gameplay here. Though again, I do love what it does for Noctis' character, with him really having to face his demons, his guilt over what happened to Prompto, and having to be separated from his friends. But eventually we do regroup and end up rescuing Prompto, where we do have some pretty big battles with a mutated Ravis and the Emperor, both of which now having been turned into demons. But the fight eventually gets too overwhelming to where Noctis has to go on his own to get the crystal, only for him to be absorbed by it. And before that, we do hear about Arden's backstory, and we do get this pretty cool sequence of the other three trying to fight against Arden before failing, and then we cut to Noctis where he interacts with the god Bahamut, who ends up telling him that he is the prophesized true king and that he will end the Star Scourge. And all of this is really great. All of this is a really great setup for the final chapter in the game, where now we know Arden and his motivations. We know Noctis' true role in all this. And that leads us to chapter 14, where we cut to 10 years later, with Noctis finally returning to Lucius, which I always loved the time skip here. While I don't feel like the narrative takes full advantage of it, I do think it adds to the grand scale of the narrative that this game tries to tell. But after fighting some demons along the road, Noctis is found by Talcott, where we ride to Hammerhead, while getting a lot of exposition about what has happened over the course of the last 10 years. We eventually regroup with Gladius, Ignis, and Prompto and return to Insomnia for the final section of the game, where we have to take on Arden. And I do think conceptually this is a really cool final mission, to be running through the ruins of Insomnia and fighting demons along the way. But in reality, within the game, you can mostly just run through most of them. You don't actually have to fight a majority of them, though eventually you do get to that Ifrit fight from the intro. That again, I think is kind of underwhelming. Again, considering it was set up all the way back at the beginning of the game, when you actually get around to it, it just comes off as a pretty standard boss battle. It doesn't really do much of note, but it is followed up by the final boss battle in the game, in the fight against Arden. And I always love this final confrontation. I'm playing as this older Noctis that has now gotten more control over his abilities. It's just really awesome. I do think the progression of this fight, where it kind of goes in the opposite of what you expect it to be, where the fight starts off with them flying all around the city, but ends up with them being in a more grounded fight by the end of it. I do find this to be a really satisfying final boss battle, and we do follow it up with Noctis ascending the throne and sacrificing himself to end the Star Scourge, and we get to see the Astral Realm, where he does reunite with Luna to destroy Arden once and for all, which that alone does feel like a bit of a conclusive ending to the story. The major story arc is completed within that, but we do get a couple more scenes afterwards. The first of which being a flashback to the night before the final mission, where we do get this really emotional scene of the group around the campfire and Noctis saying his goodbyes to the gang, which I was really happy to see, as I do feel like that is a scene that was really missing before the final fight. And it really felt like kind of wasted potential for the characters of Gladios, Ignis, and Prompto, where I don't feel like they get as satisfying of a send-off as I would personally like them to have. Even after this scene here, I do wish that they got more. But afterwards, we do get the actual final scene in the game, where you see the spirits of Noctis and Luna on the Lucian throne, which is a nice scene. It is pretty bittersweet to see this ending here. But again, I still come out of the entire ending here pretty underwhelmed by it. I mean, I do still really love the arc that Noctis' character goes through over the course of the game's story, but I really feel like the story itself isn't told as consistently as I would really like it to be. I mean, again, like the first half is really bloated for seemingly no reason, and then we get a really rushed second half here where I don't feel like the majority of the characters are given the time that they need to give us closure by the end of the story. Like, while I do think the characters of Noctis and Arden are handled competently enough, I don't feel like any of the other characters have a conclusive ending to their stories in a way that makes it feel like they were holding back from telling us the whole story in order for them to potentially do more DLCs or transmedia in the future. Again, I feel like this is a game that is filled by great ideas and is backed up with some really fantastic lore, but the execution is largely lacking due to some really questionable decisions on how the narrative is structured, and with there being some pretty clear content there that was cut for the sake of making more money on DLCs and also potential budgetary reasons. So overall, I mean, Final Fantasy 15, it really is a game that is held together to me by its great concept. As again, in reality, I've realized that it doesn't really execute on many of those concepts that well. The gameplay is a bit clunky at points. I do feel like Final Fantasy 7 Remake has kind of perfected the issues that this gameplay had, making it a much more polished combat system and having a much more visually appealing world, while at this point I do feel like Final Fantasy 15 feels a bit dated. Narratively, I feel like they waste so much time early on with story beats that don't end up mattering, only for them to rush through a story that actually does matter by the end of it. But as a whole, due to the love I had for this game the first time I played it, and the level of respect I do still have for what this game is trying to do, I still do hold a bit of reverence for Final Fantasy 15. That will probably never go away, despite me now accepting the fact that it probably isn't as good of a game as I remembered it being. So overall, those are my thoughts on the main game of Final Fantasy 15, 5 years after its initial release. Now, through the process of replaying the game for this video, I did also end up playing the DLCs for the first time, and initially the plan was to do these mini reviews of those within the course of this video as well, but after playing them and also being interested in experiencing some of the Final Fantasy 15 transmedia like Kingsglaive, Brotherhood, and the Dawn of the Future, I've decided that I think I'm just going to make that its own video. But for now though, those are pretty much all my thoughts on the main game of Final Fantasy 15. Thank you for watching.